Next, we'll talk about factoring out greatest common factors. By the way, GCF is an abbreviation of greatest common factor. There's some terminology involved here. First of all, factors are things that are being multiplied. So, for example, in this problem we just did, 2 is a factor because it's multiplying something else, and x plus 4 is a factor because it's multiplying the 2. Or a little further up, 2 and 3 are both factors of 6. Okay, so factors are things that are being multiplied. Common means shared. So a common factor is a number or variable that's being multiplied in 2 or more expressions. In other words, 2 or more expressions share that factor. In other words, they share having that thing as a factor. And greatest just means biggest. And this may be obvious, but I wrote it down anyway. To find the greatest common factor, you have to start by finding factors. Okay, for example, let's find the greatest common factor of 12x squared and 18x to the fourth. And I'm going to start out by just finding factors. And the way I do that is I say, well, 12x squared I could write as, for example, I could write that as 2 times 6 times x times x. And I could write 18x to the fourth as 2 times 9 times x cubed. And so we see that shared factors are the 2's and the x's. So we could say 2x is a common factor. However, it's not the biggest common factor. It's not the greatest common factor. This is because there's more stuff that's shared inside 12x squared and 18x to the fourth. So let's try again. 12x squared, if I break that down completely, what you might remember from an earlier class is prime factoring. The 12 I can break down as 2 times 2 times 3, and I've still got the x times x. And the 18x to the fourth, I can break down as 2 times 3 times 3, right? Because 2 times 9 times x, and there's 2 more x's in there, but they're not shared, so I'm just going to write that as x squared. So now we can see that these two things, they share a factor of 2. There's a common factor of 3. And there's 2 common factors of x. And that's everything. There's one more 2 that the 12x squared has, but it's not shared because I don't see it in the line below. There's a 3 in the line below, but there's not an extra 3 in the line above, so that's not shared. And this x squared is not shared because there just aren't that many x's in the top line. So our greatest common factor, or GCF, is 2 times 3 times x, which we would write as 6x squared. There are a lot of techniques for finding GCFs that are covered in algebra classes. I'm not going to cover them here. I've just demonstrated you can break things down completely and look for every single individual factor you can find. However, it's also okay to, if you can, to look at your two terms, or at your two expressions, whatever you want to call them, and say, well, 6 goes into 12 and 18, so I can see 6 as a common factor, and x squared is a factor of both x squared and x to the fourth, so I can see x squared is a common factor. And it looks to me like that's all the common factors there are, so that's the GCF. It's okay to do it that way also. Now, what are we going to do with these GCFs? Well, remember we said we're talking about factoring out GCFs. So an example of that kind of problem would be factor out the GCF from 12x squared plus 18x to the fourth. In other words, we want to write 12x squared plus 18x to the fourth as a multiplication problem. Now, since we've determined that the GCF is 6x squared, and I'm leaving a space here to go back and fill in some details that are optional, but if you find them helpful, you might want to use them. Anyway, we've said our GCF is 6x squared. If I take a 6x squared out of 12x squared, that's going to leave me a 2. And if I take a 6x squared out of 18x to the fourth, that's going to leave me a 3x squared. Now, the way some people like to do this, and you're perfectly welcome to do this, is to put in an optional step where they first take out the GCF from each of the two things we're dealing with here. So 6x squared times 2 would give me 12x squared, and 6x squared times 3x squared would give me 18x to the fourth. And then the distributive property says that common factor of 6x squared can come out front of parentheses, and inside the parentheses go our leftover factors. This is exactly like having an expression either in the form a times b plus c or in the form ab plus ac. By the way, factorizations can always be checked by simply multiplying the things back together.